Welcome to Sherlock Holmes Mystery. A whisper in the fog, a locked room, a death without a mark. Step into the case of the whisper that closed the case. Are you ready, detective? Where are you listening from? Tell us below. London wore its habitual veil that evening. A gauze of fog drawn thinly through Belgrave Square so that lamps were reduced to saffron smudges, and the clatter of passing hansoms arrived as if from another street. The air smelled of coal and damp wool. Within the high windows of No. 49, a house of understated consequence. A family and their staff had settled to the ordered pursuits of a winter night until a whisper, of all frail things, broke the order. Shortly after 9 o'clock, Lord Reuben Blackwell, an undersecretary attached to the Home Office and a man not given to sentimentalities, excused himself from his guests and retired to his library for 10 quiet minutes. As the butler put it later, he was seen to carry with him a folio case of green morocco, banded and locked. Its like had often ridden in a leather dispatch bag beside his knee, guarded by the unobtrusive plain-clothes presence which dogs all officials who handle papers worth stealing. That evening, however, Blackwell dismissed the shadow at his elbow and insisted so the butler again on privacy, Finch, and no interruptions. The library door closed. The hinge, recently oiled, spoke only in a genteel sigh. A minute or two later, the house resumed its gentle clockwork. A maid passing with a coal scuttle, the hushed exchange of cards in the drawing-room whist table, the clink of porcelain in the pantry. Miss Lydia Blackwell, the daughter, practiced a nocturne in the music-room, Chopin, the piece with the drooping left hand and the mournful, sustained melody until the governess asked her, half a minute shy of 10, to spare the nerves of an elderly aunt. What followed the aunt's complaint would be repeated until it became a sort of legend in the mews behind Belgrave Square. The governess, a Miss Calder from York with a schoolmistress's precise diction, later swore that as she rose from the settee she heard, faint but unmistakable, the sound of a man's voice where no man stood. It came, she said, from the little brass grill, no more than a hand's breadth across that opened in the wall behind a curtain, a trifle above the skirting board, a house-to-house voice pipe, one of those speaking tubes some modern householders have adopted to harry their servants without the exertion of a bell rope. Miss Calder, who had never put her mouth to the trumpet, knew it as a toy. Yet out of it, through the narrow flute of polished brass, came 2 syllables on a breath that chilled her. Hush, now. The governess drew the curtain aside and saw no mouth at the trumpet, only the polite gilt circle of the grill. Thinking it some jest from the pantry end of the apparatus, she rang for Finch. The butler, whose concept of humor had withered in the service of the Blackwells, testified that the house's tubes had never run to the library in which his master sat, and that the pantry end had no human attendant after 9. He went at once to the library door. It was locked. The maid who had coals for the grate stood wringing her hands in the corridor, for she had been twice turned away that evening, first at 8, when his lordship was at his desk, and again at 1:30, when he had paced the carpet with the green folio in hand. Finch knocked with the knuckles of a man who has knocked on doors for 30 years. Receiving no answer, he sent for Mr. Edwin Blackwell, the brother, who was still in the drawing-room playing an aggressive hand of whist as if the fate of armies depended on trumps. Edwin Blackwell came at speed, took the situation in at a glance, and ordered a footman to fetch a locksmith. The footman, an impressionable lad named Joseph, took one look at the set of his employer's jaw and did not wait for his hat. As he stepped to the stair, a second whisper came through the brass mouth beside the skirting. Too late. Joseph clutched at the newel. The maid screamed. Miss Calder, to her credit, crossed the hall and put a hand upon the girl's shoulder with such firmness that the scream broke off like thread bitten between teeth. Finch, who had been with Lord Blackwell since the man wore side whiskers, struck the door with the heel of his palm and demanded admittance in a voice he had not used since he had fought his way aboard a troop ship at Varna. When the locksmith arrived, breathless and sprinkled with fog, he applied his tools with a delicacy that would not have disgraced a surgeon. The bolt within yielded. The door, urged, stuck on the nap of a heavy rug, and then gave. The library presented to them the profound domesticity of a room fallen into quiet. Coal smoldered to a crust. A single candle had guttered and rolled its wax in a stagnant lake along the brass sconce. The green-shaded reading lamp upon the desk shed a neat pool of light upon the blotter and an open volume of Livy in Latin. Lord Reuben Blackwell sat in his leather chair with his head slumped upon his breast and his fingers lax upon the arms. The folio of green morocco lay on the floor, unband sprung. Its lock gaped. Its contents papers bound with red treasury tape slept untouched within. The window was fast. The hearth, tinged with the silver of half-ash, showed no coal newly thrown. The air had a faint odor, curious, but not unpleasant, of lavender and something like pencil shavings. It was Joseph, poor fellow, who put hand to his lordship's shoulder and found, with a cry that summoned them all, that the man had no breath. There was no mark upon the body, no blood, no bruise, no froth at the lips, no contortion of the limbs, only a curious dampness at the right temple, as if some cold object had kissed it and withdrawn. Finch looked at the grate, where a single blackened log gave no heat worth the name, and then at the ceiling, where a brown ring marked the old track of a leak. He later swore that the hush of the room, after the whisper through the tube, was unnatural, as if sound had been sucked out of it by a gentle mouth. The police were summoned with the discretion appropriate to a household which entertained officials and men of affairs. Inspector Lestrade of Scotland Yard, whose name was familiar to the newspapers and unwelcomed by many among the criminal classes, presented himself with a constable shortly before midnight, flanked by a thin, eager young man with an ink-stained cuff from the Evening Gazette. The journalist was shown the door with an efficiency that proved Finch still remembered Crimea. Lestrade took notes, examined the lock, the sills, the speaking tube which protested innocence with its mute brass lip, and the empty teacup upon a side table, which smelled faintly of bergamot, and had painted in the glaze beneath its foot, a tiny ship under full sail, a service from Battersea, if one may trust the markings, not the house's usual Worcester. The inspector made what use he could of the late man's collar and cuffs, his eyes and the bed of nails on his desk for blotting. He held the open volume of Livy to the light and frowned at a line over which a thin smear had been drawn by the late reader's finger. He noted the green folio and the sleeping papers within. He called in the locksmith, and had the man attend immediately to every window fastener. He sent the constable to the mews to ask after strange vehicles, and had the footman muster. He found this, he said himself in an interview some days later, that the house possessed an overabundance of hush. Not all was hush. In a corner, half fallen between a chair leg and the skirting board, lay an ivory chess pawn, the white rook. It did not belong to any set in the house. On the nap of the Persian rug a fine dust had gathered, visible only when the lamplight struck it aslant, a gray powder like that one sees on a carpenter's bench. The maid brought the household box of matches at the inspector's request, and he compared the dust upon the rug with the vestiges of phosphorus on the match heads and found them unlike. He looked again at the powder, rubbed it between thumb and forefinger, and coughed. "Graphite," said the locksmith, who had black upon his cuticles, from a pencil. At 2 a.m, with the house frayed with sleeplessness and Miss Lydia drooping like a flower after frost, Lestrade sealed the library and placed Finch outside with a chair and a blanket. It is among the small ironies of that night that Finch, who could have slept on a picket rope with Cossacks riding by, nodded off twice and started awake believing, so he told the coroner, that he had been called by a whisper at his very ear. The coroner, mild and spectacled, would later sign a certificate using as few words as possible for a learned man to permit himself. "Apoplexy," said he to Lestrade, and shrugged, for men of Lord Blackwell's age and pursuits do die in their chairs. If only the case had been an apoplexy, Lestrade might have walked from Belgrave Square as lightly as he had entered it. But the whisper at the speaking tube had made its mischief. The green folio, once examined by a discreet gentleman from the Home Office arriving in mufti, and with apologies for their intrusion, contained a draft memorandum concerning the consolidation of certain coastal signal stations and the schedules by which their codes were to be rotated. No man had touched the paper after Lord Blackwell, so far as Finch and the others swore. Yet on the following afternoon, a telegram addressed to no one, opened by mistake, its origin traced, with some reluctance, to a post office near Rotherhithe was found in the pocket of a messenger boy arrested for stealing pears from a costermonger's barrow. It contained 2 phrases, Belgrave Square, and a sequence of numbers which, when placed against the memorandum's key by the discreet gentleman from the Home Office, formed commands meaningful only to a handful of naval signalmen. By evening, the discreet gentleman's discretion had worn thin. He demanded of Lestrade the name of the man who would once have been summoned at the first whiff of a locked door and an impossible whisper. "I had hoped to keep it in the family," said Lestrade, rather stiffly, for his pride and the doctor's certificate had made common cause. "But if you will press me, I will," said the gentleman. And so it was that a hansom rattled out of Belgrave Square and made for Baker Street through the thinning fog, where, at No. 221B, a violin case lay open on the table, and a lamp burned low against a book on tobacco ashes. Dr. John H. Watson lately returned from a round of visits and, like all good practitioners, sunk to his chair with the charity of exhaustion, looked up at the bell and thought, though he had no reason to know why, that the fog had carried with it the scanted breath of a voice which wished to be believed. He rose to the sound of the steps upon the stair and the knock upon the door that, to those in the habit of hearing it, announces that the night has delivered something more than the ordinary run of human sorrow. "Mr. Holmes," said Inspector Lestrade, when he had been admitted and had shaken his hat free of mist, "if you are at liberty, I have a whisper for your ear." On many an evening in Baker Street I watched Holmes receive the world's troubles, as a man might accept a case of instruments cold, precise, instantly to hand. Lestrade's arrival that night fitted with a dozen such memories. Holmes, who had been teasing a melancholy air from his violin, set it aside and regarded the inspector without rising. "You have not dined," said he, "yet supper was pressed upon you within the hour. The refusal sits ill, for bergamot clings to your cuff, and the lint on your sleeve belongs to a hall blanket, not a cab rug. Pray sit. Watson." The lamp. Lestrade gave one of his inward grunts and took the chair by the fire. "It is Lord Reuben Blackwell," said Lestrade, "dead in his library at Belgrave Square, door locked, window fast." A voice was heard through a speaking tube not connected with the room. A green folio of government papers lay open untouched. No mark of violence. The coroner says apoplexy. The Home Office says come. "You have been in the room," Holmes observed. "Graphite dust marks your soles. A smear on the left instep has abraded the polished locksmith's bench. You sent for a locksmith." "Watson, your coat," said Holmes. "We shall see the room before the night goes stale." In 5 minutes we were rattling north. Holmes sat very still. Presently he spoke, a whisper where no tube runs. "A quiet death. Papers displayed yet safe. The odor of lavender and of pencils. The whisper is theatrical. The death, designed." "Then, murder?" I asked. "When a room proclaims impossibility, seek the hand that staged it," said he. Belgrave Square lay hushed. A constable admitted us. Finch, the butler, sat outside the sealed library, blanket about his knees. He rose with the grave courtesy of an old servant. "Your master was punctual," Holmes said as we entered. "He drank bergamot, he read Livy. He kept his speaking apparatus in order. Who cleans the grills?" "I do, sir, Tuesdays," said Finch. Holmes was on one knee at the tiny gilt disc near the skirting. He touched the brass, sniffed, and pressed a slip of paper to the rim, lifting it. In the lamplight a faint bloom appeared. He dabbed the merest grain upon his tongue and winced. Not talc, powdered mica with a trace of lavender oil. "Cosmetics?" Lestrade's impatience flared. "An elegant lubricant," Holmes returned. "Observe the crescent upon the margin. A thin tube has been inserted and turned. The mica reduces friction and imitates dust. The oil masks another odor. Watson, the window. I examined it. The fasteners were sound, the paint unbroken. On the interior sill, a gray smear lay where a hand would rest. It marked only the inside. Holmes circled the desk, scrutinized the green folio without touching it, and bent over the chair wherein Lord Blackwell had met his end. "Lavender too strong for sachets, and the right temple is faintly damp, as if touched by a cold coin." Lestrade unwrapped a brown packet. "Oddments," we noted. an ivory chessman white rook found between chair and skirting, and dust upon the rug, which our locksmith called graphite. Holmes took the rook. A rook in a study is like a fish upon a mantelpiece. The graphite accords with pencils, but why spilled? There is no pencil here snapped or worn to its stump, yet dust enough for a joiner's cuff. He straightened. Finch, did his lordship use a mechanical pencil? No, sir. Quill for letters. A lead holder for notes in the drawer with the sealing wax. By and by, said Holmes. First, the tube. He laid his ear to the trumpet, then spoke softly. Hall. No answer. Where runs the other end? In the morning room, sir. That one goes to the pantry. None to the library. Yet a whisper came, Holmes murmured. He rose. Lestrade, permit your man to break the paint at the window fastener. Holmes leaned into the fog and touched the outer stone. When he drew back, the pad of his finger glittered. Mica, said he, more along the sill, as if something smooth had kissed the opening and withdrawn. The room spoke because someone gave it a mouth, and something colder than breath touched Lord Blackwell's temple. Holmes leaned farther through the half-opened window, the fog curling about his face like a living veil. You see, Watson, he murmured, how the mica adheres to the ledge. Someone placed a narrow instrument here, something metallic and chilled to pass through the smallest crack when the latch was lifted from within. The question is, what did it deliver? He withdrew his hand, producing a lens from his pocket. A faint crescent of residue caught the lamplight. Observe, Lestrade. The mark of a small suction bell, no wider than a shilling, pressed against the pane. The lavender oil softened the seal. The mica ensured no squeal as it moved. A silent mouth at the window, quite literally a whisper. Lestrade frowned. You're suggesting, Mr. Holmes, that the sound Miss Calder heard came from outside the house? Precisely, said Holmes, through a flexible conduit, perhaps no thicker than a finger, directed into the opening of the speaking tube by mechanical contrivance. The tube itself would act as a resonator, ingenious if one sought to terrify rather than converse. He moved to the desk, tapping it lightly. Now, Lord Blackwell sat thus. The whisper reached him from the tube at his right shoulder. He turns his head so. The whisper repeats. Hush, now. He leans nearer, puzzled. Something cold touches his temple. Death follows, instantaneous and silent. There is no struggle. What does that suggest, Watson? I hesitated. Some subtle poison, perhaps introduced by vapor? Holmes nodded, though absently. A plausible notion. Let us test it. Lestrade. Have your man fetch a basin and clean cloth. While the inspector gave orders, Holmes produced from his pocket a strip of litmus paper and passed it gently across the damp patch on the dead man's temple. The blue square shifted faintly toward crimson. An acid, Holmes said softly, but of a peculiar mildness, one designed to act only when in contact with moisture and living tissue. Not corrosive enough to scar, but sufficient to paralyze the heart. I have seen its cousin employed by South American tribes in their darts. Lestrade stared. Then this was murder? Undoubtedly. The agent was administered through a device affixed to the window. The mica traces prove recent removal. The lavender disguised the odor. The graphite on the rug speaks to mechanical adjustments. A jointed tube, perhaps articulated for precision. The rook, however, is our first human signature. The chessman? I asked. Yes. No thief leaves a token unless compelled to do so. The rook denotes movement along the rank, the straight path, a message to someone, or from someone. He lifted the piece and weighed it in his palm. Ivory, carved not in England but in Vienna. Note the faint incision at its base, an artisan's cipher. The same mark was on a set I once saw belonging to Baron von Riecht, a diplomat expelled for espionage in '89. His associates preferred correspondence by chess notation. Curious, is it not? Lestrade looked uneasy. You mean this concerns foreign agents? Holmes shrugged. Let us say it concerns minds that play both chess and politics with equal relish. Now, we must trace the mechanism. The mica tells us where it rested. The graphite tells us who handled it. But we require the instrument itself. Finch, Are there tradesmen employed lately at this window? Only a glazier last month, sir, after the frost cracked a pane. Holmes scribbled in his notebook. Name? Mr. Oliver Mancy, of Charing Cross Road. Holmes pocketed the note. We shall visit him tomorrow. In the meantime, Lestrade, keep the room sealed, but for the window. If my surmise is right, some party will attempt to recover what he has lost. We returned to Baker Street near dawn. The city's fog had thinned to ribbons, and a weak sunrise gilded the chimneys. Holmes walked in silence until we reached our familiar sitting room, where the embers glowed faintly in the grate. Only then did he speak. Watson, you perceive the elegance of the design. A man dies without mark or weapon. A whisper from nowhere confounds witnesses. The message of the rook awaits interpretation, yet there remains one absurdity. And that is... He sank into his chair and steepled his fingers. Why was the green folio left untouched? If the motive were theft of secrets, it should now be empty. If intimidation, why death? The whisper was not a warning, it was punctuation. He looked at me, eyes bright with the first light of day. We are dealing with a mind that kills not for gain but for grammar. The rook moves straight, Watson, but the sentence is unfinished. Tomorrow, we shall see where it leads. The following morning broke clear and sharp after the night's fog, the pale sunlight glinting across the wet cobbles like varnish on old oak. Holmes was already at the breakfast table when I descended, the remains of toast untouched beside a cup of black coffee. His eyes were alight with that peculiar brilliance which heralded the chase, the look of a man who heard music where others only saw noise. Watson, said he, without lifting his gaze from a sheaf of notes, our midnight visit to Belgrave Square yielded 3 truths and 1 paradox. The truths are these. First, that Lord Blackwell did not die by natural means. Second, that his death was executed through a contrivance designed to imitate a whisper. And third, that the assassin handled graphite. The paradox lies in motive. Why kill a man, yet spare the secret he guarded? He rose suddenly, fastening his coat. Come, my dear fellow. We must pay a call upon Mr. Oliver Mancy, the glazier who repaired Blackwell's window. The cab bore us swiftly through the brisk morning air. Holmes, sunk in thought, occasionally traced patterns in the condensation on the window pane with a gloved finger, tiny intersecting lines that, to my eye, resembled the grid of a chessboard. When I remarked upon it, he smiled faintly. A rook moves straight, Watson. But sometimes, to see the rook, one must look for the hand that sets it in motion. Charing Cross Road bustled with the commerce of mid-morning bookshops, ironmongers, and the whiff of roasted chestnuts from a street cart. Mancy's establishment was modest, a narrow shop front with panes of glass propped like tombstones within. The proprietor, a lean man with a waxed mustache and the cautious eyes of one used to customers who haggle over every farthing, greeted us with wary civility. You repaired a window in Belgrave Square last month. Holmes began without preamble. No, 49, for Lord Reuben Blackwell. Mancy blinked. Aye, that I did. Frost, crack, inner pane. Easy job, that one. Describe the condition of the window, Holmes urged. Was it single or double glazed? Single, sir. Good oak frame, not the cheap pine most folk use. Had a tiny vent cut along the side. Gentleman said it was for air circulation. Holmes's eyes sharpened. Who made that cut? Not me, sir. Already there. I sealed it as it was. Holmes withdrew from his pocket the small magnifying lens and studied the man's fingers as he spoke. You are left-handed, Mr. Mancy. The glazier frowned. That I am, sir. Broke the right in my apprentice days. Yet the bevel on the inside of that vent, Holmes continued softly, was made by a right-handed worker. The stroke of the chisel runs against the grain from left to right. Someone altered your work after you left. The man paled. Altered it? Well, I'll swear it wasn't me. I've my ledger, if you'd like every house and payment recorded. Indeed, said Holmes. I should like to examine it. Mancy fetched a thick notebook bound with cord, its pages smudged with putty. Holmes flipped through until his finger halted midway down a page. Here, Belgrave Square, window repair, November 12th. The signature, this is not your writing. Manzi leaned closer and swore softly. No, sir, that's not my hand at all. Yet you were paid? He hesitated. No, sir. I sent an invoice but never got the coin. The reply came by post. Payment forthcoming but no address given. Funny business that. Holmes closed the book. A forgery of your ledger entry and a payment that never reached you. I suspect your name was used to mask the work of another craftsman. As we stepped back into the street, Holmes was silent until the rattle of wheels drowned conversation. A vent. Watson, barely the width of a quill, perfect for a narrow conduit. And a forger who signs another man's hand is no stranger to deceit. This window was the stage, not the crime. He hailed a cab with sudden energy. To Scotland Yard. Lestrade will by now have traced the Home Office courier who last handled those papers. At the Yard, Lestrade met us grim-faced. Courier's name was Henry Melbury, said he. Reliable man, or so they said. But he's gone missing since yesterday morning, lodgings abandoned, trunk packed but left behind. Holmes's expression grew thoughtful. Vanished without collection. Curious. Did he have any particular habits? Chess, said Lestrade grimly. Used to haunt the Westminster Chess Club. Holmes's lips curved. Ah. The rook begins to march. Watson, I believe our courier knew more than he was meant to and paid the price. We shall dine early tonight. By midnight, we may be playing the most dangerous game of all. The Westminster Chess Club occupied the upper floor of a public house off Pall Mall, a sober establishment reeking faintly of pipe smoke and chalked billiard cues. It was near 8 that evening when Holmes and I ascended the narrow staircase, our breath visible in the chill draft that prowled through the stairwell. Holmes had insisted we dress plainly, his own attire a shade shabbier than usual, his felt hat drawn low, the brim shadowing those sharp, restless eyes. A lion may enter a field in velvet, Watson, he had said as we left Baker Street, but a mouse goes unseen until it has bitten through the grain. The door opened to a murmur of low voices and the faint clack of wooden pieces. A dozen men sat in pairs along long tables, their faces haloed in lamplight. Some frowned with scholarly concentration. Others smoked and leaned back, watching the slow wars unfold in silence. A haze of tobacco drifted across the room like battlefield smoke. On the far wall hung a blackboard marked with names and scores, Melbury's among them. His last entry dated 2 nights before Lord Blackwell's death. Holmes crossed the room with the unhurried assurance of one who belongs wherever he stands. I followed his lead, drawing only the most casual glances. We took a place at an empty board. Observe, Watson, he murmured as he arranged the pieces, that these men play not merely for victory but for dominance of mind. Each move declares an intention. Each hesitation betrays a secret. The same principle holds in crime. A tall, narrow man in spectacles approached a steward. By his black waistcoat and watch chain. Evening, gentlemen. Members only after 8. My friend and I are considering membership, Holmes replied genially. We were recommended by Mr. Melbury, a frequent visitor here. The steward's expression darkened. Poor chap. Not seen him since Monday. Indeed? I had hoped to return him a borrowed volume. Tell me, did he play that evening? He did, against a foreign gentleman, Austrian, or perhaps German. Fine player, quiet sort. Name of Voss. They played 3 games, all very fast. Afterwards, Melbury left with him. No one's seen either since. Holmes's eyes brightened. Voss, you say? Tall, clean-shaven, narrow nose? That's him. Wore a dark coat, with a silver clasp at the throat. Did he ever speak of business? Not here, sir. Though I heard him ask Melbury whether he'd ever carried messages beyond the usual circuit. Melbury laughed and said, Only as far as Rotherhithe. Holmes's hand froze on a pawn. He whispered. Rotherhithe, the same post office from which the ciphered telegram originated. Watson, the pattern grows. The steward excused himself as another member called for wine. Holmes turned to me. Voss, or whoever he truly is, used the club as a recruiting ground. Melbury, with his access to government dispatches, would have been the perfect pawn. Yet when Melbury realized the nature of what he'd betrayed or to whom he attempted to withdraw, hence his disappearance, the rook, the whisper, the death all belonged to the same board. Before I could reply, A soft voice behind us said, "An elegant metaphor, Mr. Holmes, but not every game ends at checkmate." We turned. A man stood in the doorway, tall indeed, his pale features sharpened by the lamplight. The silver clasp at his throat caught the glow, a coiled serpent, delicately wrought. His eyes were gray, unreadable. "Herr Voss," Holmes said evenly. "You honor me," the man replied, bowing slightly. "A detective's leisure is merely another form of work." "Ah, but work can be perilous when one plays out of turn," Voss murmured. "You pursue shadows, Mr. Holmes. Be careful they do not embrace you." He inclined his head once more and crossed the room. The steward intercepted him with murmured protest. But Voss only touched his arm lightly, whispered something, and was gone into the fog beyond the door. Holmes watched him leave, every muscle in his face taut as wire. "He knows, Watson," he said at last. "He knows that we know. And Melbury? If Melbury lives, he is the next piece to be sacrificed. We must find him before the final move is played." He rose, sweeping the chessboard clear with one swift motion. The pieces scattered across the floor, tiny echoes of a battle yet to come as Holmes strode for the stairs, his voice low and fierce. "Tonight, my dear Watson, the game leaves the table." The fog lay thick as tallow when we emerged from the chess club, muffling hoofbeats and turning the street lamps to pale globes adrift in a gray sea. Holmes paused at the curb, his eyes narrowing as he drew the air through his nostrils like a hound testing the wind. "He is not gone far," he murmured. "A man like Voss leaves no room for chance. He would have seen our arrival, gauged our intent, and laid his countermove before the board was set." "Quick!" Watson down the steps. We descended into the narrow service lane that curved behind the building, its stones slick with fog damp. A flicker of motion passed before the mouth of the alley, a figure melting into the mist. Holmes was after it instantly, his long coat flaring like a dark wing. I followed, breath steaming, my heart pounding the rhythm of pursuit. We passed shuttered shops, iron railings glistening with dew, until the fog ahead thickened into shadow and the sound of footsteps ceased. Holmes halted, listening. "He has turned aside," he whispered. "Somewhere close. Do you hear it there? The faintest rattle of chain." A narrow passage opened to our left, hemmed in by high brick walls. Holmes crept forward, and we found ourselves in a yard where the fog pooled like milk around the base of a single gas lamp. Beneath it stood a hansom cab, its horse steaming in the chill. The driver sat motionless, hat pulled low, the reins slack in his gloved hands. Holmes approached, his revolver drawn with quiet precision. "Your fare, where is he?" The man lifted his face, and I saw that it was drained of all color, eyes open yet unseeing. Holmes touched the wrist. It was cold. A faint dark line marred the flesh below the ear. "Injected," Holmes muttered, examining the spot. "The same agent that killed Lord Blackwell, swift, silent, and merciless. Voss's handiwork, without question." He leaned into the cab and drew aside the half-lowered blinds. Upon the floor lay a small packet wrapped in brown paper, tied with coarse twine. Holmes slid it open with his penknife. Inside were two items, a pawn carved of ivory and a folded note. He spread the note beneath the lamplight. It bore a single line in a neat continental hand. "The pawn falls before the rook." Beneath it was written an address, Dockside Warehouse, Number 4, Rotherhithe. Holmes's lips compressed into a thin line. "Our adversary leaves his calling card, Watson. Either this is a challenge or a snare, but in either case we shall answer it. Do you mean to go there tonight?" I asked, glancing toward the lifeless driver. "There is no time to lose. By morning the pawn may have fallen indeed. Come, we must fetch Lestrade. This is no longer a solitary game." Within an hour, we stood amid the labyrinthine wharves of Rotherhithe, the air rank with tar and brine. Lanterns swung faintly on their posts, their light trembling upon wet planks and coiled ropes. Lestrade had brought two plainclothes men, sturdy fellows who followed at a distance. Holmes, his face grave and alert, studied the dark outline of warehouse number 4. Noticed the pattern of the windows, one unshuttered near the roof. A vent above it, newly cut, Our glazier's air channel appears again. He led us to a side door secured by a simple padlock, which yielded to a deft twist of his knife. Within lay rows of crates, and the faint echo of dripping water. The air held a peculiar fragrance, faint lavender, mingled with something metallic. Holmes motioned for silence and crept forward between the stacks. Suddenly, he froze, then raised his hand. From somewhere above came a low, rhythmic tapping, metal on metal, deliberate and steady. We advanced, the sound guiding us up a flight of wooden stairs. The upper floor was nearly bare, save for a single table beneath the open vent. Upon it rested a curious apparatus. A narrow copper tube coiled upon itself, its end fitted with a bell-shaped mouth. At the table sat a man bound hand and foot, his head lolling weakly against his chest. It was Henry Melbury. Holmes was beside him in an instant, cutting the cords and pressing his fingers to the man's throat. "Alive, but barely," he said. "Lestrade. Water. Quickly." The inspector hurried off, returning with a canteen. Melbury's eyelids fluttered. "Holmes," he whispered hoarsely. They made me. Send it. The code Belgrave Square." "Steady, my good fellow," Holmes murmured. "Who is they?" Melbury's lips moved, but no sound came save a faint hiss of breath. His eyes rolled upward, and his hand, which had clutched weakly at Holmes's sleeve, fell limp. On the floor beside him lay another ivory piece, the knight, its base marked with the same ciphered incision. Holmes straightened slowly, his face pale in the lantern light. "The knight follows the rook," he said softly, "and the game advances toward check." Holmes knelt beside Melbury's still form for a long moment, the flicker of the lantern catching the sharpened angles of his face. I saw his jaw tighten, not in despair, but in that cold, inward concentration he reserved for moments when death dared to interrupt his reasoning. He rose slowly, eyes fixed upon the copper apparatus gleaming on the table. "Watson, look closely," our whispering mouth once more. The contrivance was a thing of intricate design. Some 4 feet of fine copper tubing spiraled tightly, narrowing toward the bell-like mouth at one end. Tiny vents dotted its length, each smoothed with a trace of lavender oil. Holmes bent low, sniffed, and frowned. "Still warm," he murmured. "Recently operated. You see the residue along the edge of the bell? The same crystalline trace we found on Lord Blackwell's window. Whoever employed this instrument stood here not 15 minutes past. The faintest tremor in the air, feel it, Watson? Someone has tampered with the vent above us." Lestrade, lantern raised, stepped beneath the opening. "There's a rope freshly cut. Looks like it was lowered through the vent to hoist the thing." Holmes's eyes glittered. They withdrew their machine as we entered. We have interrupted them in the very act. We ascended to the roof by a narrow iron stair, the night wind biting through our coats. From the vent, a short length of rope dangled, its frayed end swinging idly in the fog. Holmes examined it, then turned sharply toward the neighboring warehouse. "There!" he hissed. A figure darted across the adjoining roof, dark coat, silver clasp catching the faint light. "Voss!" Holmes was in motion before the word formed on my lips. He leapt the narrow gap between buildings like a man possessed. I followed with less grace, my boots scraping the parapet as I landed hard. The wind tore at us. The fog pressed close. Ahead, Voss moved with serpentine precision, pausing once to glance back, then vanishing behind a chimney stack. Holmes pursued without hesitation. A scuffle rang out, the sound of boots striking iron, and when I rounded the corner, I saw them locked together, silhouettes grappling against the night sky. Voss fought with surprising agility, but Holmes's wiry strength and economy of movement soon told. He forced the man back toward the edge, pinning his arm. "Your game is over, Voss," Holmes cried. "The board is cleared." Voss's lips curved in a chilling smile. "Ah." But the final move was never mine to play. He twisted with desperate strength, wrenching free an object from his pocket, a small glass vial, and dashed it to the roof between them. A hiss and cloud rose instantly, white and stinging. I lunged forward, dragging Holmes back as the acrid fumes burned our eyes and throats. By the time we could see again, Voss was gone. Only the clatter of boots fading down the far fire escape marked his retreat. Coughing, Holmes waved aside Lestrade's men, who had just reached the roof. Too late, he said curtly. He has vanished into the river fog. But he has left more than he imagines. He drew from his pocket the ivory knight recovered beside Melbury and held it to the lamplight. See here. Lestrade beneath the cipher mark is a second engraving, so fine as to be invisible to the naked eye. When dusted with graphite, the pattern emerges. Coordinates. A place near the Thames Limehouse docks. I wager our friend intends to board a vessel before dawn. Then we'll catch him there, Lestrade declared. Holmes's expression remained distant. Perhaps, yet mark me, Inspector Voss is not the king in this match. He is the rook, the moving blade, not the hand that guides it. There is still another behind him, one who knows when to sacrifice a piece to gain the board. We descended once more to the warehouse. Melbury's body had been carried to a waiting cart, and the apparatus secured for evidence. Holmes lingered near the table, his gaze fixed upon the floorboards. A faint impression, he murmured, crouching to examine it, a square indentation precisely the size of the folio that had lain in Lord Blackwell's library. So, the papers were here, copied perhaps, not stolen. That explains why the originals were left untouched. I stared at him. You mean Blackwell died not to protect the documents but because he discovered they had already been used? Exactly. The codes were transcribed weeks before his death. Melbury was merely the messenger who realized too late what he carried. The whisper, the lavender oil, the chess pieces, they are all signatures of an intellect that delights in symmetry. Whoever directs Voss plays not merely for power but for aesthetic perfection. This, he said, gesturing toward the silent machine, was murder as composition. He straightened, drawing his coat close as a gust swept through the open door. Come, Watson, we go to Limehouse. If my deductions hold true, the final act of this game will be played upon the tide before the hour strikes 4. The night seemed to fold itself around us as we left Rotherhithe behind, the fog thickening again in ragged drifts that clung to the riverbank. Holmes hailed a cab, and we rattled toward Limehouse at a reckless pace, the horse's hooves striking sparks from the cobbles. He said little, save for a few sharp observations murmured more to himself than to me. Coordinates by the river. The rook retreats to the file he first advanced upon, yet the queen remains unseen. There is intelligence behind the move. Watson cold, mathematical, unerring. Limehouse lay awake despite the hour, a confusion of lanterns, shouting dock hands, and the smell of fish and coal smoke. The tide whispered against the pilings as we alighted near the docks. Farther down, the masts of moored ships loomed ghost-like, their rigging etched against a sky washed pale by the gaslights. Lestrade's men followed discreetly, melting into the shadows at Holmes's signal. Dock no. 17, Holmes said. Those coordinates lead here, within 50 yards of the waterline. Look there, see that warehouse with the iron shutter? Freshly greased hinges. Someone expects company. We moved silently toward the structure. The door stood ajar just enough to admit a sliver of lamplight. Through it came the faint murmur of voices. Holmes motioned for quiet, then crouched beside the crack, his keen eyes drinking in the scene within. I leaned beside him and saw 2 men at a long crate. One was unmistakably Voss, coat unbuttoned, the silver clasp at his throat glinting. The other was a broad-shouldered figure in a naval overcoat, his face half in shadow. Faster, the stranger ordered. The steamer sails with the tide. Those papers must be aboard. Holmes's fingers closed like a vice upon my sleeve. There lies our missing folio's twin, he whispered. Copied and ready for delivery to the continent. Voss was sealing the crate when something clattered outside a pebble, disturbed underfoot. In an instant, Voss drew a revolver and sprang to the door. Holmes straightened, stepping into the light with the calm of a man entering a drawing room. Good evening, gentlemen. Allow me to introduce myself. The larger man turned sharply. Holmes! He spat, the accent unmistakably English. I warned them in Vienna that you would come sniffing. Colonel Ashcroft, Holmes replied evenly. Late of the Foreign Office, now turned traitor to your own service. How fitting that the whisper which killed Blackwell should have begun in your hand. Ashcroft's face hardened, but before he could reply, Voss fired. The bullet tore through Holmes's sleeve as he flung himself aside. I returned fire instinctively, my shot striking the lamp and plunging the room into chaos. Shouts echoed, feet thundered on the planks, and the glow of the docks beyond turned the fog into a shifting wall of gold. Lestrade's men burst through the far door, and the struggle became a whirl of shadows and muffled blows. Voss lunged for the open shutter, but Holmes intercepted him with a fierce precision I had rarely seen. The revolver spun from Voss's hand and clattered into the darkness. For a moment the two men grappled then. With a cry half fury, half despair, Voss broke free and hurled himself into the black water below. The river swallowed him without a sound. Ashcroft, cornered and gasping, reached for his inside pocket. Holmes struck first, wrenching free a folded sheaf of papers. "The cipher," he said, breathless but exultant. "The final key to the signal codes." Ashcroft glared at him with a cold, defiant sneer. "You've won a battle, Holmes, but the war moves beyond you." "Wars," Holmes replied, "are fought on fields of reason as well as blood." As Lestrade clamped irons upon the colonel, the first pale blush of dawn touched the Thames. Holmes turned toward the water, the ripples widening where Voss had vanished, and said quietly, "The Rook is lost, Watson, but somewhere the Queen still moves unseen." The mist lingered over the river long after dawn, as though reluctant to relinquish its secrets. We stood upon the dock, the captured Colonel Ashcroft guarded between two constables, his wrists manacled yet his bearing unbowed. The man had the poise of a soldier who had seen too many campaigns to fear his final one. Holmes regarded him with that peculiar blend of curiosity and contempt that only true intellect feels for betrayal. "You had access to the codes," Holmes said quietly. "Blackwell trusted you. You lured Melbury into your scheme under the pretext of clerical duty, then used Voss to perfect your means of killing the one man who could expose you. It was as intricate as it was cruel." Ashcroft gave a thin, mirthless smile. "You ascribe too much to malice, Mr. Holmes. Nations devour one another for information, as lions do for meat. I merely chose the winning side." "And yet," Holmes murmured, "you chose wrong." The colonel's composure faltered, though only slightly. "If I did, then history will correct it. You think you've ended this? The machinery is larger than you imagine. The men you seek dine tonight in Mayfair while I am dragged to Newgate. You've won nothing but a whisper. Detective, a single move in a game whose end you'll never see." Holmes studied him for a long moment, then turned away. "We shall see who finishes the game, Colonel." Lestrade motioned for his men to take the prisoner, but as they led Ashcroft toward the waiting carriage, Holmes's eyes remained fixed on the dark water. The fog was lifting now, revealing the sluggish current where Voss had disappeared. I knew what he was thinking, that no corpse would surface there. Voss was too practiced a player to leave himself without escape. Back at Baker Street that evening, Holmes was restless. He paced before the hearth, his dressing gown half open, pipe unlit in his fingers. "The Rook and the Knight sacrificed," he mused aloud, "but the board is not cleared. Ashcroft's arrogance was not feigned. He knows of something greater still. Watson, do you recall the lavender oil? But consider lavender in each scene, not merely as concealment, but as signature. A perfume common among ladies of refinement, rarely among men. Yet in the warehouse it lingered, though neither Voss nor Ashcroft carried it. It belongs to another hand entirely, the one Ashcroft called the machinery. A woman, I fancy, with the nerve to hide in plain sight. The Queen herself." He stopped suddenly, his gaze lifting toward the mantel. "Watson, fetch the folio from the bureau." I did as he asked. He opened it and turned to a page near the end, where the original signal schedules were listed in neat columns of ink. "Here," he said, pointing to a notation in the margin, small but elegant, revised. "L.F. L.F." I echoed. "Lydia Blackwell," Holmes said softly, "the late Lord's daughter." I stared at him. "You cannot mean—" "Think of it," he pressed. "The whisper through the speaking tube was meant for her father alone. She would know the house's layout, its systems, its peculiar acoustics. Lavender was her scent. Finch mentioned it clung to the draperies of her sitting room. She played Chopin that night, the Nocturne, if you recall." Its timing perfectly matches the hour of her father's death. The music may have been intended as signal, not serenade. A chill ran through me. But why? For what reason would she? Holmes's eyes burned bright beneath the lamplight. Because, my dear Watson, she is not her father's daughter in sentiment. She is her mother's Lady Blackwell of Austrian birth, long deceased, and sister to Baron von Richt. The diplomat expelled for espionage. The bloodline of deceit runs true. He snapped the folio shut. We go to Belgrave Square once more. The Queen has made her move, and it is time we check her advance. The cab wheels splashed through the puddles along Belgrave Square, the faint drizzle hissing against the lamps as we drew to a halt before the Blackwell residence. The house loomed silent now, its shutters drawn, its grandeur dimmed by scandal and mourning. Finch received us with a face more drawn than before, his voice subdued to a whisper, as though the air itself still feared to disturb the dead. "Miss Lydia is within, sir," he said to Holmes, glancing toward the staircase. "She's not been abroad since her father's funeral." Holmes inclined his head gravely. "Inform her that we must speak with her regarding certain papers discovered among Lord Blackwell's effects. I believe she will not refuse us." We were shown to the same library where death had first whispered its secret. The fire burned low. The scent of lavender lingered unmistakably still, faint but pervasive, like the memory of a crime that refused to fade. Holmes moved about the room without a word, his eyes passing over every detail: the polished brass grill, the writing desk, the green morocco folio that now rested, sealed and safe, upon a side table. Then, hearing the soft rustle of skirts, he turned. Lydia Blackwell entered with quiet composure, her black morning gown trimmed simply, her hands folded before her. The pallor of her face, set against the dark fabric, lent her a fragile beauty that was both arresting and chilling. She greeted us without surprise, only a faint tightening at the corners of her lips betraying unease. "You have returned, Mr. Holmes," she said, her voice smooth, measured. "I suppose it was inevitable." Holmes bowed slightly. "I regret the intrusion, Miss Blackwell, but my duty compels me to seek the truth where it hides. You are aware, perhaps, that Colonel Ashcroft has been arrested?" "I read of it this morning," she replied. "His treachery shocked me, though my father spoke often of his brilliance. It seems the cleverest men are those most likely to betray." "I don't take your meaning." "I think you do," Holmes said. "Your father's death, Miss Blackwell, was not the act of strangers. It was executed by design from within this very house. The lavender that masked the poison, the whisper that emerged from a tube no servant could have reached, the revised cipher in your father's folio all bear your mark. The melody you played that night, the nocturne, ended precisely when his heart ceased to beat. It was not music, but signal." She stared at him, motionless, and for a long moment no sound stirred save the ticking of the clock. Then, slowly, she smiled a quiet, almost sorrowful smile. "You are extraordinary, Mr. Holmes," she said. "But tell me, if you have deduced so much, what motive do you ascribe to me? Filial hatred? Inheritance? Or mere bloodlust?" Holmes regarded her steadily. "Neither. You acted for loyalty, not greed. Your uncle, Baron von Richt, led a ring of agents tasked with retrieving England's coastal defense codes. Your father's refusal to assist them threatened exposure. They sent Voss, and you, bound by family and trained in silence, became the perfect instrument. But when your father discovered the device hidden in the vent and saw you for what you were, he called you by name. You could not let him speak again." Her breath trembled faintly, yet her composure did not break. "You make me monstrous, Mr. Holmes, and yet I only wish to preserve what was left of my mother's honor. My father treated her bloodline as corruption, my uncle as a traitor. When I saw the chance to restore what he had stolen, I took it. He died quickly. Do you call that cruelty?" Holmes's voice softened. "I call it tragedy." At that, she turned toward the window, the fog beyond pressing faintly against the panes. "Then tragedy will suffice. You have your truth, Mr. Holmes. Do with it what you will." Holmes exchanged a glance with Lestrade, who had entered quietly behind us. "You will accompany the inspector, Miss Blackwell," he said. England has justice enough for traitors and mercy enough for the misguided. She bowed her head once, then allowed herself to be led away without protest. When the door closed behind her, Holmes stood for a long while in silence, the firelight glinting on his profile. At last he spoke, his tone low and distant. "The whisper has ceased, Watson. But it leaves an echo. Every crime has its music, and some are written in the saddest key of all." Outside, the rain began again, soft, steady, and unending, washing the fog from the glass as though erasing the last trace of a secret too terrible to be spoken aloud.